Spitfire Audio is a bunch of professional composers making professional composers' tools, which means they can be a little bit pricey. So when we do sales, it's a bit of an opportunity for our community to come together to celebrate the fact that there are points in the year when it can be affordable to move into these professional tools. So in celebration of this year's spring sale, we're going to be doing something called The Probe. It's going to be on this channel with Oliver, Louis, Paul and myself answering probing questions, and we really do encourage you to ask those questions that you've always been scared to ask of us. Be brutal, be probing. Join us for The Probe this Sunday, 1700 hours BST. Please place your questions in the comments down below. I thought it would be good to give this show a weekly theme. And I thought this week's theme could be romance, because I think nerds and those who are capable of nerditry are in fact the great romantics of this world. Okay, full disclosure, last week we spoke about possibly looking at Escape from New York this week, John Carpenter classic, and the scores of John Carpenter. Now, through an absolute technological disaster, we weren't able to finish that show this week. So what we've done is we've swapped this week's show with next week's show, and the person I have on board today is absolutely amazing. It's going to blow your mind. So apologies to those of you who watched Escape from New York. Right, back to this romantic idea. Nerds, romantics. Well, I think there's something in what nerds do, whether that be sculpt something, a shape or a sound, or indeed find something beautiful in the mundane. There is something about the act of repetition, of being obsessive about something to create something beautiful for the rest of the world to share, that I find inherently romantic. And that's no exception here. Now, Spitfire Labs was an idea I came up with Paul some years ago. And in fact, the word labs comes from a sample that I suspected was an illicit one from a drum and bass producer I was working with. And I said, where'd you get that sound from? And he went, yeah, it's the lab. And it's grown into something truly incredible. I think we're at 3.5 million downloads now. But what's really special about labs is they're special. They're unusual, at times eccentric. But this one is really special to me for a number of reasons. If you haven't seen this yet, check this out.
This collection of haunting textures was created from stunning recordings of whale song, transformed using granular synthesis. Commissioned by me, Jarek Bischoff, and the National Theatre, these sounds formed the bedrock of my score for the stage adaptation of Neil Gaiman's The Ocean at the End of the Lane, bringing to life the horror and beauty of the narrative. This is what it sounds like. And because creativity shouldn't be complicated, we've made it into this. And best of all, it's free.
What isn't romantic about creating a musical instrument out of just the humbling sound of whale song? But also for me, just on a personal level, there's a deep sense of pride here. My father did a long stretch at the National Theatre, and much of my childhood was spent on campus there. And my mum appeared in the first cast for Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime at the National Theatre as well. So it is a place that's close to my heart. So it literally brings shivers up my spine that we can be working with the National Theatre. I think my dad would have been proud. So, whilst we're on the subject of free sample instruments and whilst we're blowing our own trumpets, do check out and subscribe to the new Piano Book YouTube channel. This is going to be a place that showcases all of the wonderful free instruments that are available within that community. And if you didn't see yesterday's show, we've crossed this amazing Rubicon, and that is 300 plus instruments created thus far, free for everyone to use. And what I am doing is actually going back through to some of the older instruments to find possibly some lost gems. Today's Sunrise is no exception to that rule. Right, now let's get over to Kellen to see what the rest of you have been up to.
Hi, I'm Dave Hilowitz.
Hello, my name's Dan Keane.
Well, hello there. Jon Meyer here. It's Friday.
and Fridays mark the start of the weekend, which, as we all know, is for us nerds. I'm Kellen, and I'd like to know how you've been nerding this week. Jon Meyer shows off his new drone and a beautiful new choir instrument that he created by recording his own family. K Gibson has shared with us a nostalgic and uplifting piece that he's written, and Dan Keene breaks down the process of how to create pianos in Kontakt. Brood has given us an appropriately brooding piece called Food for Trees, and David Hilowitz shows us the process behind how he releases his tracks. Check out those videos, linked below, and keep showing us your inner nerd with the handle NERDINGFORTHEWEEKEND.
All linked below. And I'd actually like to add one to that list. This YouTube channel is gaining traction fast, and that's no surprising. A man who is really at the coalface of the industry, similar to the contributor today, in fact. Trevor Morris is really lifting up the hood on his operation, his workflows, but also in a very two-way conversation with people who are interested. So hop along to his YouTube channel and do subscribe. These are the things that keep YouTube creators going. Right. On to this week's guest. I'm really excited about this. A gentleman whose talent is a searing light within the TV and film composing sorority and fraternity in the UK. Because not only does this guy have serious compositional chops, but he's also a producer to be reckoned with. A John Powell of the future, if I may be so bold. But also, he's someone who is touching the ears and hearts of many, many people around the world. It is very rare these days to have a successful franchise that is truly for all the family. The franchise I'm talking about is, of course, the global juggernaut that is Doctor Who. This composer has completed 2 seasons of this already. It's a real honour to introduce to you a Mr. Segun Akinola. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me. Really looking forward to having a chat.
How is lockdown for you?
I think a lot of composers kind of respond to this and say, it's not that different, to be honest, which is largely true. But at the same time, I think the other side of it is for anyone who has had a show that's been put on hold, it is very different. And I do fall into that category because I was working on something which it just had a little bit more filming to do.
Oh, no.
But they couldn't quite get it done. And so now it's on hold indefinitely. And in that sense, it's quite a strange time because you think you have a busy schedule ahead of yourself and actually you don't. And then it's like, well, what do I do with this time and how do I make the most of it? So I've been doing a lot of stuff that I kind of had put off and was like, I really need to do this when I get a chance, and now's my chance. So I have been productive.
Oh, that's good to hear. I mean, the one thing I think that possibly a lot of us composers are doing is looking at the fact that a lot of people are living the way that we've been living for some time now and working, and are actually questioning our own quality of life. A lot of people are finding it pretty onerous.
Yeah. That's so true. And I think it is still different. For me personally, I feel like I notice it most when it comes to maybe the weekend or social gatherings or events, because even if stuff is kind of going on and it's crazy, there's usually something. There will be, I don't know, a niece or nephew's birthday or something to get to. You kind of go out and see people and re-enter the world. And there's just none of that at the moment. And so every weekend is at home and it's kind of like trying to figure out what to do and how to kind of also use the downtime. Like I've been having evenings and weekends all the time, which is such a rarity to kind of get used to. But I think it's good. You know, it's important to rest as well as to work and to refill. And I think a lot of composers tend to not so much be workaholics, but to do a lot of work and find it very difficult to step back. So I think it's good to actually have time to step back and recharge.
It's interesting. When I became a dad, it was clear that I was going to have to take weekends off, and I just couldn't figure out how I was going to make that work. And I don't know if this is something you're going to take away from your experience of lockdown, but The minute I did start taking weekends off, lo and behold, became a lot more productive during the week.
Yeah, I totally get that. I mean, I'm someone who, family life is really important to me. So don't have kids yet, but I am married. But even from the very beginning, when I was actually quite young and I figured out, I want to do this whole composition thing, or possibly when I wanted to do the producing thing, I'm not sure. But either way, when I realized I wanted to do something in music, the next question was, how on earth does this work with family life? And for me, I really quickly just realized that the only way I think it can work is to have a studio at home and to work at home. The dream is have a house, have a garden, have something, in the garden that you work in. And that was before I knew that composers actually did that a lot, which they do, especially in the UK. And a few years ago, thanks to BAFTA, I had an opportunity to talk to a lot of composers over in the States and kind of find out how they are, well, just lots of general things. But one question was like, how are you handling family and young kids and everything? And all of them, every single one of them said that they have their studio at home. And if they didn't have it at home, they moved it home because it quickly became clear that that's the only way that they can juggle everything. And I know that with for parents, having that time with them, it's, well, for people who want to spend time with their kids, it forces them to have time away. But I think it's really good to try and do that anyway. And, I do try and keep things as balanced as possible. Obviously, that doesn't happen all the time, but I do take as much time off as I can. Even if I'm in the middle of something really crazy, I'll still have like Saturday evening off or Sunday off or the whole weekend off or a random evening in the week during the week, whenever I can kind of get time and just, spend some time with my wife and spend time with family and just take some time away. And I find that always makes me more productive.
I think there is definitely a degree of workaholism that runs as a kind of a vein through our profession. But do you think there's also a kind of, we're attached to the idea that we're only working when we're at our computers? And something I've learned recently is actually the good work happens away from the computer. And is that something you're aware of as well?
If you actually take time away from what you're doing and do something more mundane, like, I don't know, doing the dishes or something, your brain is then working on things in the background and it can work on things in a different way. And I think that's so useful to know, but it's difficult to know because you have to learn when to stick at it and when to take time away. And that just takes practice, I think.
We have some young composers who work at Spitfire Audio, and it's very interesting because there's one composer I have in mind in particular who will present me with stuff, and I just say to that composer, I'm not going to prescribe the solutions. All you need to do is go home, get a good night's sleep, and come back, because you will hear it. You will hear it. Why? And I think that there's always this thing of, if it's becoming difficult and if you're starting to layer stuff up, you've taken the wrong turn. I was listening to some John Carpenter scores recently, and I would really like, that's my new thing. I would say, if anyone wants a little refresher in the arm as a media composer, if you're feeling a little bit like in a rut, listen to some John Carpenter scores, because that man does nothing. But the scores are so effective.
It's so true. I mean, you also touched upon sleep, and that's a really big thing. And I feel like there are a lot of kind of stories that go around about, like, I don't know, 18-hour days for months and months and months on end, which even at the sound of it, it feels a bit like, hold on, 18-hour days for months and months, like 8 months. Is that humanly possible? Can you actually do that? And is your work any good after it? And obviously we all know that you have to pull some crazy hours to get things done. That's always the case. And you should always be doing it to the best of your ability. So if you need to make something better, you should make something better. And there are always going to be times like that. But I think the idea that this is a career where the only way of doing it is to pull crazy hours all the time is actually really unhealthy. And getting as much sleep as possible is always a good idea.
Yeah.
It shouldn't always be crazy. I
mean, no.
Something's not quite right there. If things are always crazy.
Yeah.
But there will be crazy times, and do what you have to do to get the job done.
And I imagine when it's crunch time on Doctor Who, it must be insane.
Yeah, it it is. I mean, it's mad. It's not quite American TV mad, where they're kind of doing 40 minutes wall to wall in like 2 or 3 days. But it is crazy. And that it's just a case of, as you all know, working TV, you have to have really strict processes and a really strict way of working if you want to be able to manage the workload and get through it all on time and actually have good recording sessions as well. My engineer will say I don't have crazy recording sessions whereby everything's last minute and it's late and it's all going wrong. They're actually very calm because I want to make sure that everyone can do their work to the best of their ability. And something that I know that you've said before is that you're a head of department. And for me, that falls into the same category of what's a recording session like, and do all the people I'm working with, my engineer and my orchestrator and so forth, do they have all their work on time and in the best format possible? And if they don't, is it something that's out of my hands? If there's an edit change at the last minute and it's all crazy, actually, I find that with those I'm working with, they're really understanding because they know that that isn't how things normally work. They know that that isn't how I normally work. And I want to make sure that they can do the best work because all they're doing is trying to make my work sound the best that it can as well. So, yeah, things do get crazy. And I think you have to think carefully about how you handle and manage those times so that you can get through it.
I think it's one of the skills as an HOD that it's very difficult to teach is something you touched on earlier, Segun, is knowing thyself. And I think that I'm capable of going to bed at 9 o'clock in the evening, even if I know I'm nowhere near delivery of something 9 o'clock the following morning, because I know I will wake up at 4. It's just when I wake up. I'm not saying that's necessarily a healthy thing. And I know that thing will take me 4 hours and I will nail it in 4 hours. It's overcoming your ego, I guess, to a certain degree, to go, that will be good enough. I will do the best I can in that time period, but I will do it, as opposed to just being frantic all of the time.
Part of it is just experience, and there's nothing that you can do about it. And for anyone who doesn't have the experience, I'd say the important thing is trying to be as prepared as possible for those times. So knowing, I don't know, how do you actually deliver a score? That would be a really good question. Like, how are composers delivering scores? Well, I know that I like to deliver in Pro Tools. So knowing I like to deliver in Pro Tools, how do I do that? Is it all 5/1? Is it all stereo? How many stems do I deliver? How do I figure that out? Talking to dubbing mixers, all of that stuff, which can really go wrong if you haven't planned it out. It's so important, as well as just trying to learn as much as you can, both in terms of musically and also music to picture. Even if it's the technical aspect of what's your setup like. Are you running picture in your main DAW, or are you running it in something else, like Video Slave or Pro Tools? And how are you sending stuff out to the people that you're working with?
Are you familiar with the Japanese term Kaizen?
No, I'm not.
It's a good one. This is something I really do enjoy, and it really is where the inner nerd really flourishes. Kaizen is, and I think it possibly may have been Toyota who came up with it. It's the idea of small and constant improvements. And I think what I love about the experience, and that every day is a school day as a film composer and a TV composer, when a little kind of thing, a little mishap happens, you go, oh, I can refine that process just a little bit to make things smoother. It's all of those little refinements that you make is something that's very difficult to get before you become experienced.
This is a career where there is just so much to learn. You're learning everything that you can musically. You're also learning everything that you can in terms of recording and production, because even at its most basic level in this day and age, you're going to do some recording. You're going to do some mixing. I'd argue you're actually going to do quite a bit, because probably when you get your first things, you're recording people yourself, you're mixing it yourself, you're delivering it yourself, you're doing absolutely everything yourself. And that's not even touching on the filmmaking side of it, both in terms of how edits will be sent to you and how you need to sync things up, let alone actually just scoring a scene and just telling the story of a scene. And I think that notion is all the more important in what we do, because there's so much to learn. You can't learn it all in 5 years or 10 years. It takes a really, really long time. And all you can do is try and make little improvements all the time.
You work on a franchise that is interesting and rare, because there's something, you get these thematic through lines throughout the seasons, but really it is in many ways an anthology series, in the sense that it tends to be a different setting every time. Now, I know, because I work on a series called Inside Number 9, I know that these things are quite rare, but it does pose a rare challenge, because you're not setting up a template for your series. You're not cutting and pasting themes from all over the place. And is that a challenge you relish? But is it also a difficult one that you have to kind of work into your workflow and go, well, we need to allow a little bit more time per episode because it's a different world?
I really, really love it. And I think a lot of that comes from the kind of composers that I look up to, and the fact that they're people who have their own sound but can move around as well, and can move around with that sound, and are unfazed by something that's more electronic and unfazed by something that's more orchestral, or any combination of those. And so that, alongside, I think, learning, I learned the drums growing up as well as the piano, but particularly with the drums, my drum teacher, his dad was a very well-known UK session drummer. And so I was kind of brought up in the session drummer mold, which wasn't, well, I'm a rock drummer or I only do jazz. It was you're going to get thrown something and you've got to be able to play, no matter what it is. And he was really, really influential, because he basically taught me that I had to appreciate all kinds of music. And there was no excuse for not appreciating all kinds of music. So there was a lot of listening to anything and everything and trying to understand it, and then knowing how to approach it as a drummer, and knowing how to walk into a rehearsal or whatever it might be and do a really good job. And I think that actually really influenced my writing alongside the composers that I was really interested in. Or maybe it also influenced which composers I liked as well, because that kind of gave me an aim, something that I was kind of looking to achieve, is to, as much as possible, try and be able to write in a lot of different styles. I naturally enjoyed a lot of different styles, and coming up in school, I was playing in a lot of different situations, from musicals to orchestra to big band to all sorts. But also trying to do it in a way whereby it didn't just sound like, well, I'm just trying to copy a load of all the greats in all these different areas, but there was something of me in there. And I think that really influences how I look at and approach writing, and look at the composers that I really like. And I think that, in a way, influences everything.
Yes.
And influences even all the things that I find really inspirational as well.
You're head of department for an entire season. I imagine, do things overlap, and do you really have to police that overlapping?
Yeah, they do. I mean, generally, sometimes there's a little bit more time for episode 1. Sometimes there just isn't. I have a really, really great relationship with Chris Chibnall, the showrunner, and Matt Strevens, the exec producer as well. So we work very closely as a unit. There is a schedule, and there are dates when there are dubs and when things have to be handed in. It's a very VFX heavy show, which means that by its nature, not all of those dates are going to be hit, because something always comes up. There's a problem with a shot. It's got to be shortened, or it's got to be lengthened, or this thing happens, or something else happens. And then all the normal stuff as well. There's an edit that overruns, or an edit's difficult, or whatever happens, all the stuff that happens across all of these shows. And so we come up with a plan at the very beginning, which essentially states when music will be delivered in terms of drafts for an episode, when they need to be signed off, and then when they will actually get delivered to the dub. And so once the season gets going, I'm usually somewhere between 2 to 3 episodes. I'm kind of usually writing one episode, possibly mixing the previous episode, and then spotting the next one, or about to spot as well. My day can be quite funny because on the one hand, I'm kind of getting mixes in from my mixer and kind of checking them and writing notes. And then I'm also trying to write a lot of minutes because something's happened and it's like, oh, I've got to get through things really quickly. And then I'm also trying to plan ahead for the next episode. And that's generally how we work on it. I mean, we have a very structured plan, and then sometimes things will happen just with the production that mean that, I've got less time or I've got more time, or usually it's less time, sometimes it's more time. But pretty much we have that, and then it's only when something happens that we'll kind of change that and nudge it, and stuff always kind of happens. But yeah, that's pretty much how it works.
It's an interesting hierarchy that it took me many, many years to understand. Was, I would fear the director, and therefore the producer is someone you should fear even more. But what I did learn that was, in fact, that sometimes the director, through no fault of their own, through a desire to create something wonderful, can create problems with the schedule and with the time that you have. And actually, producers are there to help. And, you have to do it diplomatically, and you have to do it kindly. You don't have to it's not ringing up to kind of grass up the director. But, to be able to say, as your head of department, I'm worried that we're slipping behind here, is not a bad thing to say to a producer. They prefer that you're honest because they can jiggle stuff around. They prefer not to.
Yeah, that's so true. Again, I think it's this whole terminology of head of department. And to be honest, I think the first time I really heard it is after I'd watched one of your videos and you mentioned it, and I thought, do you know what? That is so true. It's so true, and I don't think it gets spoken about enough. So actually, well done to you for mentioning it, because I don't think people consider it. I think they think that a composer just
put the
sits
cloak
in a
on.
room. Yeah, cloak and a quill, in a dark room somewhere, and writes their masterpiece and then throws it under the door to someone who figures the rest of it out. And they waltz into a session and they wave their arms about and they kind of shout at musicians who are terrified at them, and then the score gets done. And it's nothing like that at all. And your responsibilities as a head of department are very, very similar to the responsibilities of all the other heads of department. You have a budget. It is your responsibility to deliver the score on time and on budget. Doesn't matter if partway through they say, oh, well, we didn't think we were going to have strings, now we're going to have strings. It's then your responsibility to speak to the producer and say, well, look, we didn't plan to have strings and we can't afford strings. So if we're going to have strings, we've got to figure something out. And then we've got to, talk about the options and just find the best way forward to make sure that you're happy with the score and the director's happy. And, it'd be nice if I'm happy with it as well. But it's your responsibility to manage that budget. And I think on a TV series, especially one where the music changes every week, it's a constantly moving puzzle. It's not a case of, we just have a session, every couple of weeks. What is that session made up of? I mean, for me, it's always different pretty much every episode. So it is my responsibility to make sure that the budget is taken care of. And when something will come up, I mean, maybe a shot gets changed and a cue that was recorded now actually needs to be changed in some way. And it's like, well, is it easy to make an edit? No, it's not easy to make an edit. Okay, what do we do? And it's my job to figure out what to do. And for anyone else who's a composer and a head of department, it's your job to do that, as well as to manage all the other people you're working with. Even if that's just a mixer, or it's an orchestrator and a mixer, or an assistant, or whatever else is going on, it's your responsibility to manage it.
Now, so I put it to you that if you grew up in this kind of session musician environment, it may have been explicitly said to you, but I imagine it's something that you would have even kind of subconsciously absorbed, that what makes a successful session musician is 50% his ability or her ability to be a good session musician and 50% someone who other people like to be in a room with. And wouldn't you say that that is also a key part that's very difficult to teach with head of departments, is the interpersonal skills are complex because the hierarchy is complex. You're in a recording studio, you're very much head honcho in a room where there's another person who is your head honcho.
Yeah, it's so true. And again, it's one of those other things that I think people sometimes miss when it comes to the work that we do, that it isn't just that, we have to write some music and we have to work with people. We have to work with people, and we have to work with people who at some point in the process are going to be under a lot of stress and a lot of strain. Different people deal with that in different ways. Forget how you deal with it for a second. They deal with it in very different ways. And there's a lot to learn about those moments as much as there is just about how you talk to people. Some people are very keen on not really communicating any issues or problems, but just absorbing everything, not passing anything on, not going to the producer when, they all of a sudden need some strings to be done or whatever, and kind of handling things that way. And there are pros and cons to that, and there are consequences to that, just as there are to actually being really open and honest about everything. I remember talking to someone who put it this way: you have a spotting session with the director and you talk about everything and you think that you're all on the same page, but the director leaves and you have a thought and you think, oh, actually, this thing isn't quite clear. If you call the director up half an hour later when they're back wherever they need to get to and say, do you know what, actually, there's just this one thing that I'd really like to clarify, does that make them feel more or less sure that you know what you're doing than if you didn't clarify that thing, you do it how you thought best or how you thought they meant it, you get to the next session, they come in and they listen to stuff and it's not quite right. Like, you have to think about all of this stuff and be very clear about, what you personally feel. And people are different. People as composers are very different in terms of how they want to run things and manage things, but there's a lot of running and managing things, to be perfectly honest, and you have to have the right people around you to help you with that, whether that's you do or don't have additional writers, or you do or don't have someone who runs your office, or you do or don't have an assistant who is doing lots of Pro Tools work for you. It's all down to you to figure out how you work with people, both in your department and then actually working with directors and producers and any politics involved with that as well. And the more people involved, the more complicated it gets. Who's really in charge? Something I don't feel like gets talked about a lot is when you're at the start and you're going in for a meeting about a project, and your interpersonal skills in that meeting and that kind of situation when they're meeting a lot of composers, and how you have to think carefully about how you come across and what you want to say. You kind of have to be, chilled, relaxed you, but then you also have to sell yourself and what you're thinking of doing for the score. It's very complicated.
Talking about music's like dancing about architecture. It is, of all of the arts, the most difficult thing to talk about. So you're going into an interview to dance about architecture. I come from acting stock, and I always think, wouldn't it be funny if you auditioned like actors have to? Like, okay, so the scene is, and you had to stand there and sing. Or
or like there's a piano and you have to like walk in and just there's a scene in front of you, you've never seen it before, and you've got to do a live improvisation to it. Oh, I'd be terrified.
I will work on some shows where really the producers take the lead and the directors are there, getting stuff done, may not even turn up at the dub. Even with within those kind of infrastructures, you will get directors of different kind of levels of experience who wish to be more hands-on, less hands-on. And for me, it's a little bit like ballroom dancing. Do you try and take the lead with your directors, or is it something that you kind of have to learn on the fly?
It's a good question. I think it depends on the situation and what I'm working on, like a series compared to a film. And also then if it's a film, how well do I know the director? Is it first time thing? Is it not? Doctor Who's really quite rare because it is quite literally a very direct relationship between myself, Chris Chibnall, and Matt Strevens. So
that's interesting.
They are literally the people who would say no, but actually I just work directly with them. So what they say goes. Everything else in TV, certainly that I have seen, it's a bit more of a committee, and that becomes a little bit. Well, it's just a very different thing because you have the producer for the series, you may have the exec producer or a couple of exec producers for the series, and then you'll have the director of episode 1 who, by their very nature, has more of a say than the director of episode 4 because they're setting the style. But at the same time, they're also not the person who's going to be there for the whole thing. And you may or may not also have writers who may or may not have a greater say or less of a say than the director. And, I refer to that as the committee, and that's much more committee scoring to me, where it's a case of, okay, well, the thing I can't do is have everyone emailing me separately with all of their individual thoughts, because that doesn't work. That is a little bit more of needing everyone to agree on a way forward and figuring out. I know that Hans Zimmer said this a lot in interviews, figuring out who's really in charge. And those situations are the same as this. You have to figure out who's really in charge. Is it the writers, or is it the exec, or is it the producer, or is it the director of the first episode?
Or the editor, who can be exerting huge amounts of influence on the process. I think you're absolutely right, and I think it is a measure of a good producer who goes, no, we're not going to get the best out of this person if we're all giving like opposite views. We have to gather our views, and I'm lucky and fortunate, as I'm sure you have, to have worked with such producers. Just before we move on to the film of the week, I just wanted to talk. There is often a temptation just to stay in the box and not to book sessions. And I think as composers, we always want to book sessions. And suddenly you have a piece of machinery that cannot move, that you're trying to insert into this other piece of machinery. That, I'm sure, on a multi-episodic series, the likes and the scale of Doctor Who, must be incredibly complex.
I really very strongly believe that relationships are based on trust and openness. And that's very much the same, whether it's a friendship or a marriage or whether it's a working relationship for me. And so for those I work with, there's got to be a very clear route of open communication. And so all of this stuff has to be talked about, even understanding who's going to give you the call if things are going crazy, or if things start to move and they become a bit unclear, who can you call? Who will know what's really going on? Maybe it's the post-production supervisor rather than the producer. It depends on the dynamics of the situation that you're in. And those are the people that you need to call at times when something is running late, or it's not clear and things have gone a bit quiet. So you're like, I'm not sure what's going on. And you've got a session coming up and you need to kind of figure out how to handle it and what to do. Personally, I have live players on almost everything. They bring so much to the music. Even if it's just a solo player and I can only afford to get into a little studio, I'd rather sacrifice some of what I've apportioned to be my fee, which is another thing with being a head of department. You've got a whole pot of money. You've got to pay for everything and also pay yourself.
Or not.
I'd rather kind of... or not. I've got to figure out, I'd rather just have, a trumpet player come in, just go into a studio with an engineer for half a day and sacrifice some money, have someone play it, then do a sample. I take so much more enjoyment from it as well and love the interaction of working with players. So I record as much as I possibly can.
But I don't think the desire to use musicians is the cloaky, beardy, weirdy part of being a composer. I certainly approach it from a very pragmatic head of department point of view. I'm working on stuff that's very, very low budget, say Inside Number 9, but I just know that it makes my job so much easier. That I'll have to spend a third of the time working with the samples and stuff if I know that there'll be a central, even just one central point of focus that will move people to tears.
The enjoyment of working with musicians and the quality of the end product, I think, just outweighs everything else for me. And quality is, again, also something that is really important to me. You know, I want my work to be the very, very, very best that it can be every single time. You know, the best that I can possibly produce at the time. And for me, working with musicians is definitely part of that.
Never a truer word said, Segun. And I think it's something that's not really spoken of, but you know, our art, or craft rather, as heads of department is not only composition, as we've discussed it, it's not only delivery of a score, but it is also score production. And a massive part of that is working with musicians. I say there's never an excuse at any point in your career not to work with musicians. There's always a mate who's willing to do a favour in return for a pint. And even if it is just whacking an SM57 in front of your pal's cello at home, this will give you really valuable air miles as a score producer, as someone who works with musicians to take what you're working on, possibly with samples, converting them into notation and conveying your hopes, wishes, desires, and that of your director onto another performer. Best to get practicing sooner rather than later. Right. On to this week's film. And again, apologies for those of you who watched Escape from New York. I hope that wasn't an hour and a half lost. And if just cross fingers, if we can make it happen, I hope to get back to it, if not next week, the week after. So this week, carrying on with the romance theme, the romantic comedy from 2007, Hitch, starring Will Smith and Eva Mendes. It's the tail end of an age that I was all too familiar with as a singleton. Part of that age of the Sex in the City where love, where romance, where relationships was somewhat transactional. The premise being that Will Smith is kind of like a business consultant, but with relationships. And he himself goes on a journey discovering that really relationships are not business acquisitions. I think for me, it reminds me somewhat of the Ricky Gervais film, The Invention of Lying, where no one lies and he's the only person who has that capability. I think there's a similarity with this film in respect of empathy. It's as if Will Smith is the only person on the planet of Hitch with empathy, and he utilises that to best effect. So, Segun, this is your choice. Why?
Well, I thought it would take people by surprise. For me, it is one of my favourite George Fenton scores. And I think it's an interesting time to also look back on it, because rom-coms are making a comeback at the moment, largely because of Netflix. Because away from the big studios, Netflix can actually see what we're all watching, and they see that actually people are watching loads of rom-coms, which is why they're making so many of them. And not just making American rom-coms, they're also making ones which are, you know, largely based in the UK or largely a UK cast, and not just the UK, but actually around the world as well. So I think we're going to get more rom-coms as time goes on. And as we have more streamers, I wonder if some of them are also going to start doing them to try and compete. Certainly for the streamers who have a similar demographic and variety of content as Netflix, I think we probably will start to see more of them. And for all the conversations about comedy scoring that I've seen in the last few years, it's really all been about playing it straight. You know, the music should not be comedic. The music should just play it straight, which I think is not only valid, it's one of the best ways of scoring a comedy, but it depends on what that comedy is. And one of the things that makes Hitch really interesting for me is that it doesn't do that, but then it's also not the first thing that I think of when I think of a rom-com score. I tend to think of like lots of pits, strings, and like woodwind, and like, you know, long sweeping lines, but very much pure orchestra. And this score is not pure orchestra at all, but it also can't quite be pigeonholed into another style. You can't just say like, oh, it's just a jazz score. Oh, it's just a big band score. Well, no, it takes from all of those areas, but actually it combines them with lots of different things, and classical and more poppy stuff as well. And I think when you mention the name George Fenton, people think about his big docs, which are fantastic.
Yes.
But there's a lot of other work that he does, and probably the other thing is also that the production on that score is superb. I wanted to be a producer when I was younger, so I'm really, really into production, and it always stood out to me as being a score for which it actually sounded like some of it could have been a record. And I don't always get that feeling with a score. Sometimes it feels a bit score, you know, where they've kind of like gone into a studio and just recorded it, and it's like stick up a microphone on the guitar, get it done,
whack
get
an
out.
Apple loop on, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas this really didn't. It really sounded very different to me. I think in the last few years we've had a few scores which actually are quite similar in that the production is amazing. Ludwig Göransson is probably, I would say, like the cause of that, because all of his scores, whether it's Creed or Black Panther or The Mandalorian, the production is amazing, and you can tell that there's a producer behind it, because he's also an amazing producer. But for me, Hitch always stood out, particularly in that decade. And I was actually really lucky to have a chat with Steve Price, may his soul rest in peace, the engineer who passed away a few years ago, about Hitch. And it was really interesting because they basically just did it like a record.
Yeah.
He said that they actually took a couple of weeks to figure out which microphones were the right microphones, and to test things out and try them, rather than just, you know, running in, first microphone there, getting it done and getting out, which, you know, there's nothing wrong with that. And we all know that scores are expensive and hard, and you've got to get it done as best as you can. But it always stood out to me. And I think that a lot of that production really stands up today.
What I felt is that the score and the needle drop knitted really well, and always on rom-coms you get loads of needle drop, and for me it always feels a bit clunky. It feels like, okay, put the needle on the record, off you go, montage, run. Whereas I think there was a real blending, and there's a moment, I think it was on Ellis Island, where he did break the strings out, and it was just for me, it was an aperture shift that really worked. It didn't feel clumsy, it didn't feel like, whoa, where did that orchestra come from? And I think they were probably in there at points before, but it was suddenly, it just opened up. And I think that what I enjoyed about it is it does take you on a journey. I think the performances are very, very good. But I also have to say that what I was surprised about it is, like, jeepers, we've had a very rapid change in the way that we can depict these things. I mean, that's only 2007. It's not long ago. Do you think they could have made it the same way today?
Film as a whole?
Yeah.
No. I don't think it's aged quite as badly as some other things have aged.
Yeah.
Some things have aged really badly. And it's quite interesting rewatching those things now and thinking, ooh, that joke's not okay. But
you don't have to go that far back. I mean, Sex and the City is pretty much unwatchable. And I think that Hitch was on the tasteful side of, I think that at that time, people really were commodifying relationships. And really, I think what is kind of refreshing about the film is it starts with that kind of idea of basically he's a business consultant to get you your relationship. And he's proven wrong. So it's nice to come out the other end. But it still very much feels of that era of the Sex and the City of girls do this, boys do that.
Yeah, exactly. And in that sense, it doesn't stand up today. And it's quite interesting rewatching, because I did feel like, oh, actually, yeah, I actually thought this whilst watching it. But as with all things, it's you know, we're looking back on a particular time and a particular way of thinking, and it's right that things have changed.
Yeah.
So I don't think they can make it in exactly the same way. I think there is that, well, enjoy it for what it is or what it was at the time when it came out. And also enjoy the score as well for what it is, and for all that it does, because I think comedy scoring gets forgotten a lot when we talk about great scores. And to be honest, all scoring is hard to some degree. So I don't want to say that other genres are easier or harder or anything, but they are tricky, and doing a comedy is tricky, and doing a rom-com is tricky, and doing a rom-com today is going to be tricky as well. So it's all about knowing what's happened in the past and figuring out the right way forward.
Both my parents are comedic actors, and I always think that comedies get a poor rap, really, in the sense that you'll never win an Oscar for a comedy performance. And I think that's what, you look at Will Smith, who is originally a musician. He's not a stand-up comedian, and his comedy chops are, he's got that. He's one of the best comedic actors working today. And I just think that's very undervalued. It's like, I think possibly one of the greatest character actors ever to have lived is Eddie Murphy. And he's a comedian. But he doesn't get the accolades that he deserves, like particularly those multi-character scenes that he does in his films. I do think it is a terrible shame. And as you say, I think that trickles down all the way to the scores as well.
Yeah, it does, and it's kind of strange. I don't know why that is the case, and I don't know why it's still the case. Because actually, all you have to do is watch a comedy that isn't very good. That as soon as you watch something like that, and I can think of a few films off the top of my head, you realise how good all those other comedies with all those other actors and directors and so forth are, and how hard they have to work. And I think that probably the current person to talk about is Adam Sandler and his films, because Uncut Gems, I still haven't seen it, but he's an actor he's genuinely an amazing actor. So he does very different films. He does serious films, and he does very much not serious films. Doesn't matter. I think it's a bit like music, and a bit like people who have an idea that good music means this thing or that thing, and there's a hierarchy, and it's like, to be honest, good music is good music. Doesn't matter what it is. No. Just make it good music. That's all that matters. I
totally agree. And we had Rupert on last week, who's a long-time collaborator with Adam Sandler. I got to work assist Rupert on Click, and was fascinated by Adam Sandler's very scientific approach. There's nothing that can step on a joke more than a bit of music. And he's meticulous about how the music works around his comedy. There are some funny moments in Doctor Who, and there's always this question of how we actually handle those moments. And usually there's a lot going on, and it's like we're in a really tense moment, but actually, and it's the beauty of doing a family show, there's a funny line, like just right in the middle of all of this crazy tension. And it's always a question of, okay, so I've got to keep going with the tension. I've got to do something with the comedy, but then there's also something else going on. Maybe it's also heartwarming. Chris and Matt always joke about, how I've got to do 5 things at once. This is why I think it's really important to really know and study comedy schools, because whatever you learn can be applicable not only to comedies, but everything else that you do. And a lot of other genres will have a funny moment or a funny scene. And I find if I'm watching something that's quite serious, but there's one funny scene, and you can tell that they've struggled with the score, because all of a sudden it's been this really like dark, brooding, dramatic score, and then all of a sudden out of nowhere, pit strings out of nowhere, and it's always really light and bubbly. You know that they've really struggled in the edit to get the tone right. And those moments can be really tricky, because as composers, I think we're very sensitive to other scores that we see. And I find those things kind of really pull me out of the dramatic tension or the drama or whatever's happening. So I think it's really, really important to just try and learn as much as you can and figuring out all these different ways of doing things. And also that there are no rules. No. There's no rule that you must take out the music when a joke comes, or
you must do this thing or that thing. It all depends.
There are two genres that I find very similar to work on as a composer, and I've worked on quite extensively on both. Probably more on horror than on comedy, but I do think horror and comedy are very similar, because when you go to a preview, it is so blatantly obvious when it's not working. People are not screaming, or people are not laughing. And I would say that, I've done a lot of action stuff, and the stuff where I've had to be really frame accurate has been on the horror and on the comedy, because you can really murder a shock or murder a laugh. And what I found is little unexpected things like, when an engineer mixes something, they may add a little bit more reverb than you had, or the reverb tail may be longer. And suddenly the daylight between your music and the gag or the shock is reduced and doesn't work as much. So it's you've got to be on your toes with those genres.
Yeah, that's so true. And I think that's a really interesting point, because it goes back to the whole head of department thing. Because if that is the case, and you know that you're doing something particular, like maybe you've specifically had less reverb in your demos for something, or you've taken out the reverb because there's a dead cut or whatever it is, it's one of those things that you when you're working on the mix with whoever your mix engineer is, you have to tell that person, this thing is happening for a very specific reason.
Yeah.
So please can we make sure that we keep that idea, or that we do the same thing, or whatever it might be. That can be quite a feat in the flurry of, oh gosh, it's all written, and now it needs to be all recorded, and now it needs to be all mixed. But it's one of the things that you have to keep on top of.
The one prerequisite I say to anyone who's getting someone to engineer to mix their work is you must find an engineer who is willing before every cue to listen to the reference mix, because that has been signed off, and it's basically make that sound good for all systems and blend whatever live musicians we've recorded in.
It's so true, because you sell the director and the producers and everyone else on this demo, and people do have different approaches to it. Some composers, they just do a demo and then they just give stuff to an engineer and they're like, do whatever you want.
Yeah.
Other people are more like, I don't want you to change anything. Don't change anything. Just add the live stuff in, and kind of everything in between. Demos are really good. And I think you only have to look at all the millions of videos on YouTube of particularly all the stuff going on in America, all the people based in America, to hear just how amazing some of those demos are. Not a random demo that you spend 6 weeks working on, but in the midst of this huge film that's going on, you sell people on this demo, and what you give them as the final product has to be as good, if not better. But if it is better, it can't be different.
Yes,
that's
better, not different.
Not different. And it's just... And it can be a really, really difficult line. Yes. And I definitely know that there are times where, as you know, I work with Gertz a lot. And there are definitely times where, he might say, oh, this thing. And I'm like, that is a fantastic idea. But this thing came up in the notes. So I know that if I do that, it's going to go back. And it's going to be a whole thing. So we just have to not do that, or have less reverb here, or whatever it might be, or keep something panned in one direction. But all those moments are so important, as you know.
Well, Gertz very much comes from a new generation of engineers who aren't egotists. And I think the same probably applies to my generation down of composers. I think the generation above me, they're a little bit more cloaky and beardy. A little bit more Italian-y with the phrasing, and where we can't do that because of the wibbly wobblies. And I think that I came up through the ranks with engineers who were very creative, which is great, but also quite egotistical. And I think that is really the last point of the process for us as a head of department, and for the post-production process as a whole. And the last thing you need is a big ego walking in the room at that point.
On the one hand, people talk about the egos they work with in terms of directors and like, oh, they're a nightmare and all this kind of thing. But the funny thing is, for all of the notes you get from that person, if you're working with an engineer, a recording engineer and a mix engineer and anyone else on your team, you're also giving notes at some point. And I think it's really, really important that the same applies everywhere. Just as much as you want to work with a director and producer who are supportive, but understanding and clear, but also challenging at the right moments, and all those things. Hopefully you want to be the same to all the people that you work with, and you don't want to encounter a really egotistical person as a director, and actually you also don't want to find that in your mix engineer or your recording engineer or anyone else. But then also hopefully you realize you shouldn't be that to them as well. And it's just all those people skills apply across the board and across every stage of the hierarchy of who's working.
Listen to what Segun has said today. This is just an absolute vault of sage advice. And so pleasing for me, after nearly 3 years of kind of waffling on into these cameras about what I think you should do as composers, to hear similar kind of advice coming from someone who is considerably younger than me is really encouraging. It's really well worth listening to, heeding to. Vaughan Williams, Symphony No. 8, D minor. It's a funny thing that. Back in the day, do you think people used to look through kind of the concert programs and go, I like that Vaughan Williams guy, but I just can't stand stuff in D minor? Anyone who has any historical knowledge of why that is, please put them in the comments down below. So this is Movement 4, Toccata, which, Segun, you introduced me to. I've never heard before. Now, I'm not really good at spotting composers, but there's a few that always stand out. I would say, where film's concerned, John Barry and Thomas Newman. You can sniff them off a mile off. Elgar is one as well. And I would put Vaughan Williams into that category. So thanks for introducing me to this piece, Segun, because it totally came out of the left field, because if I'd blind tested it, I would have said Aaron Copland.
Oh, that's so interesting. I heard it for the first time about a couple of weeks ago, and I stumbled upon it as well. I wasn't going looking for it. I can't remember what I was doing. I was looking for something else and just happened to hit play, and I just loved what I heard. And it's the last time in recent times that I heard something and thought, that's amazing. You know, when you hear something and it gets you excited.
Yeah.
Which I think the more you work in music, the greater the amount of time between those moments, because you're more aware of what's happening. You analyze things a lot. You listen to a lot of stuff. So I think those moments where you do find something that really excites you are all the more exciting. And this was it for me. And I think it's particularly a piece whereby you can kind of hear film music in it, but you can't hear only film music in it, if that makes sense. You can hear that it's clearly influenced some really popular composers, but then it also doesn't sound like they've just copied Vaughan Williams, and it doesn't sound like Vaughan Williams is writing for a film. But I think it's a really vibrant and bright and exciting piece, and it kind of barrels along the whole way, even during the quieter moments. And yeah, I'm looking forward to. I've done a little bit of studying with it, and I'm looking forward to doing some more.
And is that something that you do a lot of? Do you try and immerse yourself in music wherever possible, or do you kind of lock yourself off when you're really mid? What I fear is like you're just about to nail, finishing off, just about to go off to the orchestrator, and you go, oh no, that kind of idea is better if you listen to external forces.
Yeah. I mean, I totally understand that people are on different sides of this, but for me, I listen to music every day, every single day. And I learned very, very quickly that I'm not very good if I'm doing loads of writing and I'm not listening to other stuff. Because I kind of end up I feel like I'm in a loop, because I end up regurgitating myself and kind of just getting stuck in the world that I'm writing in, as opposed to being influenced by other things. So I always listen to stuff that's very different to what I'm writing. That's probably the first thing. And I also don't listen to a lot of film music outside of actually, I generally don't listen to film music outside of a film, or TV stuff outside of a TV series, unless I'm specifically needing to do something. So if whatever I'm working on, I'll just listen to something very different. And I start my day actually by listening to some music. And I find that it's just really inspiring, and it can be a source of interesting ideas. It might be like, oh, there's an interesting rhythm in this particular thing I'm listening to, and the music I'm writing is not very rhythmic, but it's kind of sparks an idea of how to do something in a slightly different way. And also I think it just keeps music fun, and at the end of the day, we're all here to have fun. So
yeah, it's always my argument of why I don't work on NS10s. And it's got to be fun. I often say when I'm writing a piece of music, there'll be a point in production where my fingers learn it. So for me, it's very much about muscle memory and shapes. And what I'll often do is listen to music not to take in something as a whole, but is to find a new shape. So you go, what actually is that chord? And that inversion and the way that they've voiced it. And that just one shape can unlock a whole new kind of wormhole of activity.
We are the result of everything that we've ever heard. And I think that really is true. And I think it's good to listen to as much as you possibly can and try and learn something about, the things that you do like and you don't like. And it doesn't matter whether you know music theory or not. That really does not matter. The important thing is wanting to learn about music and learn about how to create a particular sound, or even if it's a feeling. Like if you, actually a good example with this particular piece, the Vaughan Williams, is that about 35 seconds in, there's an explosion of sound. It's like this great big chord. There are a few chords, but a great big chord. That was the moment that I thought, oh my gosh, this is amazing. I think it's really useful to know how to get to those moments as much as it is to know, these specific things are going on at this moment, which might just be, I can only hear the top note and the bottom note, and these are interesting. Or I can hear the whole chord. It doesn't matter what it is. Just learning as much as you can and actually hearing the stuff that's leading up to it and hearing how it's kind of getting you there slowly, bit by bit, and why it's so exciting that something explodes in the way that it does is important. I think important when it comes to the idea of big and busy and scale, and that if you want something to sound big, stuff needs to sound small at some point. Otherwise, you won't get the comparison between them.
So how long have you been pro now? 10 years or 8 years or?
I was thinking about this the other day. 10 years ago, I was assisting another composer, and I did that before I did the whole kind of educational stuff. And I think that was really key because it basically set me up to understand that I can't learn everything that I want to learn through education, but I can learn some of the stuff I want to learn through education. So for me, it was very much a case of I was learning, and I'd had this really solid foundation through assisting another composer. And then I just started working whilst I was learning, and then that kind of carried on, and then I just kind of carried on working. I did at one point make a decision to... I basically done some stuff, and I was like, well, I can either go and find another job, or I can kind of just see how this goes for a little bit. And I saw how it went, and I'm still seeing how it goes in that sense.
Oh, it's an amazing journey you seem to be on. If there was one thing that you could go back 10 years and Segun now say to the Segun then, what would it be?
Weirdly, I think that the thing that stands out the most, or the thing that I kind of regret the most, is actually not practicing piano enough. So this goes back more than 10 years because it goes back to when I was really little. But I actually started learning the piano first, and that was all very classical and stuff. And it was great and interesting, but what I really wanted to learn was the drums. And so my background was very mixed, because as much as I was doing the whole, I'm in piano lessons and reading music, I was also doing I'm in a band with friends, and I'm also playing in the big band in school, and all, a whole mix of stuff. And it was actually really when I figured out the whole, I really want to do film, that I kind of went back and took a second look at the whole classical side of things. And I really wish I had actually just kept it up. I did grades and stuff, but I did what I had to do to just pass my grade, as opposed to really taking it seriously. And I wish I'd taken it seriously, because I think those sets of skills, the kind of popular music set and the classical set, are basically pretty much, I would say, what most composers need to some degree or another to do film scoring, because I don't know. 1 minute they say they want a classical score.
Oh, yeah.
Next minute it's like, oh yeah, like drums and guitars and stuff. And you've got to, know how to do that. So I wish I had kind of kept the classical stuff going a little bit more, or just put a little bit more effort into it rather than just kind of keep it ticking along.
Well, as we say, we're on a lifetime of learning with composing.
Yes.
So you never say never. But also remember, they say style is defined by your limitations.
Yeah, I like that. Very, very much.
I'm holding on to that for dear life. I've got loads of limitations. Second, it's been an absolute pleasure. I do hope the rest of lockdown is productive for you and there's a lot to take away from it. But most of all, that you stay safe, yourself and your wife. And thanks again.
And to you too. And I hope that you have a great opportunity to do whatever it is you want to do. Chill out and relax, or get lots of work done and spend time with family and everything. And thanks for having me.
Thanks a lot, mate. So whilst we're talking about inspiration through music, we also get inspiration through sounds. And I have to say, I think this is the best one of these so far. There's some really good stuff in here.
To kick off this week's piano drop, we've got Jon Meyer with his Bass.ic or Basic, a kind of boring yet incredibly useful synth sound. Now he says, I initially planned on this being a bass-only synth instrument, but opening up the filter proved to be way too much fun. He sampled tweaked sine, square, and triangle waves from his Novation Peak, Korg MS-20, Roland JU-06, and Behringer D. He's got a walkthrough video here, and over in Kontakt, plenty of parameters to mess with and create just the right synth instrument for you. A very useful instrument indeed.
I just love it when you go, you've really got what it is we need, John. And this is just fantastic. It's that subtone that will give you something in all sizes of speakers. Absolutely. But it's just everything you want from a bass synth. Thank you so much for that, John. And that's going to be absolutely part of my arsenal moving forward.
Next, Alejandro Magana Music gives us his Willis & Go 2. Around 8 months ago, I purchased a piano for my home studio, the first piano I ever bought for myself. Although slightly out of tune, we moved apartments in Montreal in the winter, never a great idea. This piano has a very special character.
Talk of romance, it might be worth checking my video above, which is kind of clickbaity titled at the moment, but it's about beta testing instruments. And some of the tips that I give, I think this instrument would benefit out of. There's just a few little bits of kind of unevenness that are worth polishing out.
Anders Wall is back with another fantastic submission, the Tono. I had been working on a show for a few seasons and wanted to iron out some of the hiccups I had producing the music. One thing that always stood out was the acoustic double bass. I'd been using a commercial available library, but it always needed a ton of EQ and had too much character.
What I'm loving about this is there's a sense of the room that you've recorded it in. So often with these type of bass samples, they're very kind of, whoa, it's like you put your ear next to it, and there's no sense of kind of roundness to it. It's lovely, mellow sound.
Next up, from all the way up here in Scotland, it's a marimba given to us by Liam MacLean. Back in February, I went to my old college in my hometown to speak with students about some of the work I've done since leaving college and university. While I was there, I sampled the marimba they have.
Marimbas. Not the easiest things to sample, I may hasten to add. But you've done a very fine job. Absolutely stunning. The gifts that we're being given this week are just incredible. That's a workhorse instrument, that.
And last but not least, Annie's Clock, given to us by Buffa. It all started in December 2017 when a choir member gave me a clock. I'd started conducting a community choir that year, the previous conductor having moved to the other side of the country. I'm not sure quite why Annie, the choir member, decided to give me a clock a few weeks later during the preparation for the group's Christmas Eve concert. I suspect it was either a gift with the subtext of, I've really enjoyed singing in choir this year, or a subtle hint for me to start and finish rehearsals on time.
Now, I don't know why I don't have the GUI. I'm sure it's absolutely gorgeous, but we'll just have to go in blind and hope that none of them blow my speakers. Ooh! I like that lever. All of these instruments are linked down below, and just pianobook.co.uk. Go there for the font of inspiration that it is. And do remember to subscribe to its YouTube channel. Right, on this channel, Sunday, 1700 hours BST, we're premiering a new thing called The Probe, which may or may not become a semi-regular thing. Basically, Spitfire Audio is a bunch of composers making sounds for composers, and what we want to do to celebrate the spring sale that's on at the moment is to just kind of really bear all. I see a lot of comments online saying, they never seem to answer this question or that question. Well, often it's simply we're never in a forum where we're asked. So I've really encouraged everyone to give us some really probing questions. Don't be gentle. And we'll endeavour to be as honest as we possibly can be without letting our pants down. So it's going to be a wonderful panel of composers, and I hope you'll join us. I'm going to be live online on live chat at 1700 hours. But if you can't watch it then, just catch up with it soon. So reason to subscribe if you haven't done already. Ding that bell to be notified the next time I put a video up. And one of those for Segun. And do listen to his advice. It is an absolute treasure trove of stuff that he's had to live through. We've had to live through these things, so maybe you don't have to. See you soon, take care, and thanks for watching to the end. Bye-bye.